Hi, everyone, and welcome back. So we are going to read chapters 16, 17, and 18 today. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. So we are on chapter 16, A Morning in the Dark, page 154. Here we go. The university school was built around a central courtyard. Gracie Hall, now the lower school, that means elementary school, had been built in 1903 as home for John Dewey's Radical New School. And John Dewey is a real person. If you're going to become a teacher, you study John Dewey. Forming the west side of the quadrangle, King Hall had been built almost 30 years later for the University of Chicago's Education Department. The idea was to be able to observe what was going on in Dewey's now famous laboratory. A new middle school building, built in 1990, was on the east side, and the high school, built in 1960, on the north. Hobbyfield Hall, tucked behind the high school, dated back to 1904 and had music and art rooms. Remember, there is a map if you want to check that out. You could pause this. It's in the front of your book so you can see where all these different buildings are located. The following morning, Calder and Petra sat down on a bench in the Gracie Hall lobby. They were facing a stone fireplace that had a bust of Francis Parker on the mantel. Parker, a colleague of John Dewey's, had a university high baseball cap on and a red scarf around his neck. The painting is small, remember? The canvas is only about a foot by a foot and a half. Calder was fiddling with his pentominoes. Think, hundreds of kids and grown-ups go in and out of this building all day. There are cleaning people in here at night. What's a place that no one would disturb? Calder pulled a pentomino out of his pocket and looked at it. They both stared at the T in Calder's palm. T for 12. There aren't 12 floors. I don't get it, Calder shrugged. Petra sat up straight, her knees cupped in her hands. Let's try to think like Miss Hussey. She'd find a place with no leaks or mice or anything. Calder was tapping the T back and forth on the wooden bench. 12? Does Miss Hussey have 12 of anything? She wears all those earrings. There's a key, a pearl, a high-heeled shoe. Calder was muttering now. Key, pearl, shoe, shoe, pearl, key, pearl, shoe, key, heel, key, pearl, heel. Hey, that sounds like keep her here, doesn't it? Petra laughed. Now you've got me thinking like a pentomino. Maybe this means she's in Gracie Hall. Calder, in his excitement, gave Petra a quick bear hug. Good thinking, he said. Straightening her glasses, she tried not to look too pleased. He and Petra agreed that they should pretend to make a master map of the school. This would give them an excuse to poke around during lunch. None of the classes, aside from their own, would know that it wasn't an assignment. At lunchtime, armed with measuring tapes, clipboards, and pencils, they covered the first floor, checking even unlikely places. They looked in storage closets, behind file cabinets, under the beds in the nurse's office, inside old paper towel dispensers in the bathroom, around the coat rack in the director's boardroom, and beneath hats and mittens in the lost and found. On day 2, they covered the second floor, although it was hard to be thorough. Most of the classrooms had 100-year-old built-in cupboards and drawers and bookshelves, and it was awkward explaining why they had to look into those to measure the room. Petra got bitten by a hamster, and in the science room, Calder accidentally allowed a box of hissing cockroaches to escape down a heating grate. Petra dropped a hunk of limestone being examined by a 4th grade geologist on her toe, and Calder got a 3rd grade teacher angry by trying to look behind her bulletin board and knocking off some drawings of the Great Chicago Fire. They had worked their way through Gracie Hall, except for the basement, which was locked. They decided to talk with Mrs. Treck, the lower school principal, or elementary school principal, about letting them in. Always enthusiastic about kids' projects, she could be counted on to help. They explained about the map, and she agreed to take them down there the next day. That defeats the whole purpose. Calder was digging in his locker for his math book. He didn't realize that Petra had walked ahead. A voice behind him said, "Talking to yourself? Where's your girlfriend?" It was Denise. Calder felt his face get hot and slammed his locker door. Someone ought to hide her somewhere, permanently. On Monday morning, they met up with Mrs. Trek as planned. Reminiscing about kindergarten field trip in the basement, a tradition in the lower school, Calder and Petra watched as the principal struggled with the bolt. They had forgotten how weird the place was. The walls were fieldstone, and the floor went up, hill, and down. Right angles had clearly been abandoned below ground level. They saw piles of rolled rugs, broken benches, a tangle of plumbing pipes, even a clawfoot bathtub. There were spidery shapes made out of old desks, stacked top to top. Mrs. Trek had just unlocked the supply room when her cell phone began to ring. A parent needed to speak with her in the office. "Oh dear, will you be okay down here for just a minute? I'll be right back." As soon as she left, Calder and Petra opened the supply room door. Reaching bravely into the blackness, Calder groped around for the light. It wasn't on the wall by the door. He took a couple of steps into the room, ran into a string hanging from the ceiling, and pulled it. Shelves of construction paper and boxes of pencils and rulers jumped into focus. Teachers were allowed down here for supplies. Both kids could imagine Miss Hussey using it as a hiding place. There was no time for talking. Quickly, they ran their hands along the shelves and looked behind cartons, tried to lift crates. On one side of the room were several old picture frames. Behind them, leaning against the wall, was a small package wrapped neatly in brown paper. It wasn't as dusty as the others and was just the right size, no doubt about it. They heard steps coming down the stairs and Miss Trek calling their names. By the time the principal reached the supply room, Petra was alone. Petra told Mrs. Trek that Calder had needed the bathroom and had gone back up. As they walked towards the stairs, Petra asked if they could return in the middle of the morning. "I'm afraid I won't be free again until tomorrow." The principal smiled kindly as she locked the heavy metal door. "Think you can wait?" "Sure," Petra said, her mind racing. "No problem." As soon as she got to the classroom, Petra told Miss Hussey that Calder had a morning dentist appointment and slipped into her seat. She tried, but it was just impossible to pay attention in class. She excused herself to go to the bathroom more than once, tore down to the basement door each time, knocked softly. There was no sound from inside. Calder stayed crouched for what felt like hours. This was the darkest hour he had ever been in. The basement didn't seem to have any windows. At one point, he heard a scurrying around. He knew that Gracie Hall, like most old buildings in Hyde Park, had mice. And there were also those hissing cockroaches that had disappeared down a vent. He stood up. Holding the painting carefully, he took 2 steps, then 2 more. What if there was some monster living in his basement? Someone who had snuck in when the janitor wasn't looking. Humming tunelessly, he felt his way up to the stairs. When he got to the landing, he tried the door to the first floor. The handle turned, but the door was bolted. He crept back down, trying not to touch the walls. Better to stay out of sight. Maybe if he was lucky, someone would come down to get pencils and leave the door open long enough for him to slip out. He reminded himself that he was probably holding one of the greatest treasures of the art world. So we have an image on page 161, but it would be our every other one, right? So it doesn't have anything in theory. But we see Calder clutching what we think is the lady writing in the basement. It looks like maybe some pipes are in the background there. He looks worried. I would be too. I was locked in a basement. All right. What were a few hours of his next life next to all the adventures the lady must have been through in her 300-some years? Besides, now he and Petra would be famous. They'd be interviewed on TV. They'd be in the Chicago Tribune. Groping his way along, he found a chair and sat down slowly. He'd better stop daydreaming. A number of things had to happen before the painting was safe. if it was the painting. To occupy himself, he worked on some puzzles in his head. First, he made 3 different 12-piecers. Then he tried writing to Tommy, but without the code, it was tough. Then Calder felt himself wanting to doze. It was so quiet and so dark. Petra hurried down to the lower school office at lunchtime. Miss Trek isn't here, dear. She's gone for the rest of the day. The secretary looked irritated. Petra felt a rush of determination. The basement. My friend Calder and I need to finish an assignment by today. Is there someone who can let me in? We don't allow kids down there anymore. You know that. Miss Trek said it was fine for us to finish our research, though. Petra lied. She said she'd make an exception, please. Plus, we're 6th graders. The secretary looked at Petra and sighed. All right, just let me get my lunch. While the secretary was gone, Petra looked carefully at the top of her desk. Maybe the keys were inside the drawer. If she found them, should she race down and let Calder out? If the secretary came with her, she'd discover Calder had been there all morning. It'd be better to get blamed for taking the keys. She stepped quickly over the desk, jerked open the drawer, and found, sure enough, the fat ring of master keys. Stuffing them into her pants pocket, she headed toward the basement entrance as fast as she could go without looking conspicuous. She waited outside the basement door, pretending to use the payphone until there was no one in either direction. Her hands were fumbly and damp. First one key. No. Then another. No. Someone was coming. Petra picked up the phone again, her heart pounding wildly. She felt sure the person walking by would hear it, but they didn't stop. The 3rd key turned easily. Pulling open the basement door, she clicked on the switch and slipped inside. Calder! Calder! She whispered at the foot of the stairs. There was no answer. It was too quiet. Couldn't he hear her? As her eyes adjusted to the dark, she made out a small figure slumped in a chair. The package was still held tightly in his arms. Her first thought was that he died of fright. She hurried over and gave him a prod. He popped her upright. Geesh, Petra, I ought to get 10 pounds of blue ones for being down here all this time. I'm glad you're all right, but hurry up, Calder. I had to steal the keys. Hurry. They were up the stairs, peeking out the door, and in the front hall in seconds. They clicked the basement door shut behind them. Petra grabbed a jacket from the lost and found box in the lobby and covered the package with it just as the secretary came around the corner carrying her lunch. Well, hello, you two. I'll be right back to let you in. It won't take long, will it? Silent, both shook their heads. As soon as she headed off toward the office, Petra looked at Calder in panic. Now what? What do we do about her keys? Leave them in the door to the basement. She'll think Mrs. Trek left them there. Petra and Calder were too nervous to talk on the walk home from school. They raced up Calder's front steps and straight to his room. Both struggled with the zipper on Calder's backpack. In the rush at school, he had pulled it in closed on the fabric. Stupid thing. Calder grabbed scissors from his desk and cut open the backpack. They pulled off the tape wrapped around the brown paper. The edges of a dark wood frame emerged, and then an old backing. They turned it over. Someone with an eager, pear-shaped head and a green bun sat writing at a table. Her one visible ear was graced with what looked like a dangling ping pong ball. There was an orange moon behind her and a melting castle. The painting might have been done by a second grader who was now a grandparent. It was not the lady they'd been looking for. Chapter 17, page 167. What happens now? Calder was home with a cold the following day, and Petra walked home from school by herself. It was nearly December, and patches of ice alternated with drifts of brown leaves. Petra scuffed along, thinking about Charles Fort. He wouldn't be feeling discouraged. He'd have his eyes wide open. With that in mind, she picked up a scrap of graph paper off the ground and read, corn oil, butter, tea bags, onions, green grapes, bacon. She popped it into her pocket. Was there poetry here in these accidental combinations of words? Would Fort have seen an interesting pattern or secret of the universe in grocery lists? Hey, this might be something they could get into with Miss Hussey one day. Accidental combinations of sounds and ideas. Why did some words seem more elegant, more graceful than others? Why were some words peanut butter and jelly sounds and others caviar? What made the words onion or teabag so plain? Why did a word like ice or exquisite sound so lacy? Inspired by the idea, Petra spotted another piece of paper. It was tucked into a thorny hedge near Mrs. Sharp's house and torn along the bottom. Folded in four, it looked worn. She opened it carefully and began to read it. Dear friend, I would like your help in identifying a crime that is now centuries old. Dun, dun, dun. All right, let's pause and look at our illustration on page 168. In theory, there should be pentominoes and frog or frogs, right? Oh, I did just find a frog really fast. That was a little obvious down there by the sidewalk, right? Closest to us. I think that's called the forefront of the picture. But I'm sure there's more. I'm going to put a post-it note there. No. So I can go back and you don't need to wait on me trying to find all the pentominoes. Okay. Petra ran straight over to Calder's house. Did anyone see you pick it up? I looked around. Only one person crossing the street. Calder blew his nose vigorously. You know, like real loud. Do you think it's the same letter you started to read? The one that blew away? How could it be? Maybe there's a fourth letter, Petra groaned. Calder reached for his pentominoes. It's creepy to think of someone sticking that letter carefully in Mrs. Sharp's bushes. Do we tell the police? It'll make it harder for us to keep looking. Good thinking. But neither one of us should walk around here on our own. We could end up like that frog kid. They refolded the letter, placed it neatly inside a sandwich bag, and tucked it into the geographer's box. They each ate a blue one. Then they each ate two more. Calder was holding the P pentomino. P for pray, he said, trying to grin. Petra looked horrified. Pray? P-R-E-Y. She said, us? You mean we're being hunted? No, I meant pray, as in hoping to stay alive, hoping to stay safe, Calder said. Maybe it's pray that we're not prey, Petra added, scaring them both. The next day, more news broke. A book appeared in the stores that morning called The Vermeer Dilemma, What Happens Now? Easily a $50 art book. Pay attention to this. A new book was just released. The book was called The Vermeer Dilemma, What Happens Now? Easily a $50 art book. Art books are very expensive because of all the ink that goes into those detailed colored pages. That's why if you go to Barnes & Noble or something or Amazon, art books are still very expensive. It was being sold for an unusually affordable $1.50. This was less than the price of a Big Mac. An anonymous gift had made it possible for everyone with an interest in Vermeer and in this painful situation to buy the book. Written by a respected art historian, it included an excellent color plate of every painting attributed to Vermeer for $1.50. Thousands of copies changed hands across the United States on the first day, and countries around the world reported similar sales. I don't think I read that right. Thousands of copies changed hands across the, okay, yeah, I did. People are sharing the book. The book was about all the positive things that had come out of this terrible crime. People were looking at and talking about paintings as they never had before. They were comparing furniture, tile work, the structure of a leaded glass window, the folds in a satin skirt. They were comparing details like the way light struck a fingernail or a wrist bone and the look of a woven basket handle or a curl of hair. They were examining works of art with a toughness and intensity usually seen only in the buyers of new cars or electronics. Groups of people pointing and arguing energetically in front of a Vermeer had become a common sight. Museums were busier and livelier places. It was the first time that many untrained people had felt that they could say something of value about a work of art, something that might make a difference. It was the first time that many people had realized how murky and changeable the waters of history can be. When an artist leaves behind no personal papers, when hundreds of years go by, who is to say that followers or forgers didn't use his or her name to make some money? And of course, the idea of correcting a centuries-old mistake, of pointing out that the experts in museums and universities weren't really as expert as they thought they were, was irresistible. Children were thinking about Vermeer too. They were comparing writing and visiting museums with friends. Many said that they hadn't realized how cool old pictures could be. They also hadn't realized that the art in museums can be mysterious, that grown-ups don't always know what it means or where it came from. The author talked about how this uproar was also good for art historians and museum curators. It was forcing them to question views that had been accepted for decades, to look carefully at what they had been taught. Was the thief right? Was the public right? Why didn't the so-called early and late Vermeers have that luminous, haunting touch? The book ended by stating firmly that while what the thief had done to get the attention of the art world was wrong, the public's relationship to Vermeer and to other great masters had, as a result, changed drastically. People around the world had developed a comfort with great art that they had never had before. The theft was a gift. The last page carried a message to the thief. Whether or not museums chose to change the wall labels next to some of Vermeer's paintings, the public had done an amazing job of spotlighting any possible fraud. Everyone was now looking. It was only a matter of time, the authors suggested, before museums would respond to the public's thinking. In the meantime, a lady writing should be returned. The thief would consider his mission to have been successful. And here's our last chapter for today, chapter 18, A Bad Fall. Okay. Petra and Calder talked about the book on their way to school the next morning. All these questions being asked by people around the world, Petra said, still excited by what she read. It does make the theft seem partly good. Yeah, but what if the thief turns out not to be as moral as he sounds? What if he's a real sicko? Someone on the radio was talking about that this morning. Petra looked sideways at Calder. But don't you think I would sort of know if the lady had been hurt? They walked several steps in silence. Calder kicked at a snowbank. Maybe, and maybe not. I wish she'd say something else to you, like down this street, up those steps, in this cupboard, and presto! They were laughing when they turned the corner near Mrs. Sharp's house. To their horror, they found themselves facing the flashing lights of an ambulance. The children stood, mouths open, as a stretcher appeared at Mrs. Sharp's door. The old woman was neatly strapped under a mound of blankets. She looked tiny and pale. 2 policemen followed the emergency technicians. Mrs. Sharp, are you okay? Blurted Petra. Calder called out, what happened? At the sound of their voices, the old woman turned her head. Oh, good, it's you two. Close your mouths before your tongues freeze. Mrs. Sharp struggled to get her hand out from under the blankets. Stop, you carriers. I want to speak with the children. I know them. Mrs. Sharp's imperious tone brought everything to a standstill. I slipped and cracked something in one leg. Very stupid of me, I must say. Never broken anything in my life. I was planning to take this letter to the post office today. I could have someone in the hospital mail it, but I prefer giving it to the 2 of you. No problem. Calder reached for the letter in Mrs. Sharp's hand. She watched with something of her old fierceness while Calder put away the letter. Now, don't forget and don't lose it, boy. Miss Sharp was eyeing the duct tape on Calder's backpack. The 2 of you can visit me at the hospital later if you'd like. I'm sure by then I'll be stuck in some dreadful room. Don't worry, Mrs. Sharp. We'll mail your letter. Want us to bring you books or anything? Petra asked. No, no. Oh, the pain of this darn leg. Stupid, stupid. Mrs. Sharp collapsed back on the stretcher. All set, ma'am? One of the EMTs asked her politely. Well, yes. Does it look like we're sunbathing on the Riviera here? Mrs. Sharp's voice trailed off into the freezing air as she was loaded into the ambulance. They watched her drive away. Poor thing. I guess we won't be having tea with her anytime soon, Petra said. I wonder who this letter is for. Calder reached into his backpack and pulled it out. It was addressed in neat handwriting to Miss Isabel Hussey. They held the letter up to a bright light in school. The envelope was impossible to see through. Giving it directly to Miss Hussey was tempting, but they had made a promise to Mrs. Sharp. It was hard to know who to be loyal to or what the consequences of either decision might be. After school, they crunched through the snow to the post office on campus. Maybe we could steam it open, Calder suggested. Maybe she's just sympathizing. Maybe we're just suspicious, Petra said. Hey, what if we rip open the envelope and then put the letter in a fresh one? We'll just rewrite the address. In their excitement, they stopped and gave each other a high five. Petra suddenly looked unhappy. But aren't we getting pretty two-faced here? We go there for tea, we act like nice kids, and then we betray her? How would we like it if someone we trusted read our mail? This is probably how people turn into criminals. They just do something a little bit wrong and then something a little bit worse. It's not like we won't mail it afterward. We're keeping our promise. It's an emergency situation, remember? We're on a mission to rescue Miss Hussey. The lady, Mrs. Sharp, and ourselves, we may be in danger too, now that we've got the third letter. So we have an image on the left. Doesn't make sense just yet, I guess. It looks like someone's stepping on a letter and there's a hand there. So this is to protect everyone. Right. We're just doing a little much needed detective work. They were now inside, standing next to one of the slits in the wall that read stamped mail. It has a stamp on it already. We could buy an envelope and redress it here. Calder dug in his pocket for change. Petra still looked worried. What will Miss Sharp do to us if she finds out? And what if Miss Hussey recognizes our handwriting? This is foolproof. We're going to put the letter in the mail the minute we've read it. Miss Sharp will never know, and I'm sure Miss Hussey will throw away the envelope. So it seems that Calder is like, gung-ho, let's read it. And Petra is like, I don't know. Just then, someone jolted Calder's arm and the letter fell. Calder reached for it, and his backpack swung off his shoulder, knocking both him and Petra sideways. The letter was now under a man's leather boot. Ach, so sorry. This is going in the mail too? The man then swooped the letter up in a large red paw and stuffed it into the slit along with his mail. I don't believe it, hissed Calder. Petra gave Calder a weak smile. I guess we've been saved from a life of crime. When they arrived at the hospital, Mrs. Sharp was lying flat in bed. One leg was heavily bandaged. I can't give you tea, but you can have these. They're all I could get a hold of. Mrs. Sharp handed them each a large chocolate lollipop and pushed some buttons that made the head of her bed go up. I want to thank you for mailing my letter. The three of them sat for a moment in silence. I suppose you're wondering what that letter was about. Calder looked down at his lollipop. Petra swallowed loudly. Mrs. Sharp's eyes narrowed. Children, was that letter mailed? There is something you're not telling me. Calder decided to come clean. Well, you see, we noticed the letter was to Miss Hussey, and she's our teacher, you know, and we've been following the thief's letters and advertisements in the Chicago Tribune, and we're working together on trying to find the lady. And Petra had a dream about the lady, and so we wanted to read the letter. We were just curious to see if you were worried about Miss Hussey too. Stop! Did you open my letter? Miss Sharp's voice was frightening. No, Petra whispered. It was my fault too. We thought that because you're smart and you like Vermeer, you might know something about the theft, and that you might have some good ideas. We are curious about why you wrote to Miss Hussey. We are going to read your letter and then put it in a new envelope and mail it to you, but we didn't end up opening it. That's the truth. I'm really sorry, Mrs. Sharp. I don't know what got into us." Petra was almost in tears. There was a long, unbearable silence. Neither Calder nor Petra dared look up. Then a strange creaking sound came from the bed. Mrs. Sharp was laughing. It sounded as though she was a little out of practice. The children looked at her in amazement. "You're not angry?" Calder asked. "Oh, not really." Mrs. Sharp was drying her eyes with a tissue. I see myself in the two of you. I've done many things in my life out of curiosity and have regretted very few of them. The important thing here is that you stopped yourselves before you did something wrong." Her face straightened. "Very wrong. The point is that you must never read someone else's correspondence." After allowing the children to feel uncomfortable for another few moments, he continued in a brusque tone. That's one of our vocab words. "My maiden name, Coffin, is from Nantucket Island in Massachusetts. And when I read in the newspaper that Miss Hussey was from there, I just thought I'd share the coincidence with her. Now, what is this about a dream?" Grateful that Mrs. Sharp didn't seem to be too furious about the letter, Petra started talking. She described in detail her dream about the painting, confiding that no one but Calder knew about it. She mentioned that Vermeer's lady sometimes seemed to communicate with her. Mrs. Sharp studied Petra intensely as she spoke. The old woman's eyes narrowed until they were almost slits in her face. "Yes, she's speaking to you." "Excuse me?" Petra's voice was almost a whisper. "Well, there are many things about life, many experiences that we don't have an explanation for, as Mr. Fort said. But what interests me is the idea that much of what we humans take to be a lie is true, and much of what we think is true is a lie." Mrs. Sharp was speaking slowly, looking at her hands. "Charles Fort would have said something to you like, 'Who's to say that art isn't alive anyway? Who's to say what's real? If frogs can fall from the sky, why can't paintings communicate?'" Calder had hopped up from his chair. "Petra, remember the Picasso quote that Miss Hussey told us about art being a lie that tells us the truth?" "Sit down, boy. You're making my leg nervous." For Mrs. Sharp's frigid tone sent Calder back to his seat. Her face settled into an unreadable expression. "Truth. Perhaps. You think you two could succeed where the FBI has failed?" "Well, nothing happens in life unless you try. And we're pretty smart kids, you know." Calder had pulled out his pentometers and was quietly making rectangles on the table next to Mrs. Sharp's bed. "We haven't even told you about these." "Smart. You think so?" Mrs. Sharp watched Calder for a moment in silence. "What are those, boy? Some kind of new toy?" "They're pentometers," Calder responded with dignity. He told Mrs. Sharp the letter name of each of the 12 pieces. Then he explained that you can make many, many rectangles out of them, but it took practice. "Push that table over here." Mrs. Sharp tried putting the pieces together for a few minutes, mumbling 12 pieces. Under her breath again and again, everyone was quiet. No rectangles appeared. "It's hard at first. It takes time," said Calder kindly. "Ha!" Mrs. Sharp was looking frustrated. "I can think of something else you could do with these. How many, 5-letter words, say, could you make using at least 3 of these 12 letters in each word? Ever done that?" "No." Both children were leaning toward the table now. Mrs. Sharp was saying, "Let me see. The letters are FILNPTUVW or MXY and Z. I think she says M because that's just W upside down." Yeah. "I love word challenges like these. Fines, flute, lines, filmy, tails. Hey, that's 13 letters. Who said the W could be an M?" asked Calder. "I did." Mrs. Sharp was busily pushing around the pieces. "Wilts and tilts," added Petra. "Melts," shouted Calder. "Lower your voice, boy. We don't want one of those policemen outside the door to start bothering us. Now, if you could add another letter, you could have monkey, and then there's panel. And vines." Mrs. Sharp was looking very pleased with herself, muttering, "Vines, fruit," and at that moment a nurse bustled into the room. Time for your medication, Mrs. Sharp. Oh, go away, she snapped. The nurse refused, and Calder and Petra stood up to go. As Calder picked up his pentominoes, Mrs. Sharp nodded at them. Wonderful tools. Could be put to many uses. Yes, I even like to, Calder began eagerly, but Petra was pulling on his arm. We've got to go, Calder. Mrs. Sharp thanked them for visiting and waved one hand in dismissal. As they walked away, they could hear her arguing with the nurse. That night, Calder got a phone call from Tommy with terrific news that he and his mom were moving back to Hyde Park. Tommy didn't know exactly when this would happen, but he said that the Dewey Avenue Rescue Fund, the money Calder and Petra had collected by selling brownies, was a definite help. Old Fred, that was their stepdad, right? Old Fred hadn't left much behind. Then Tommy told Calder more news. Frog had been found. His parents had gone on a long trip and left him in Washington, D.C. with a relative. No one in Tommy's New York neighborhood had been willing to tell the new kid, in Tommy's words, what was going on. Either that or they were all so unfriendly that they didn't know or care where Frog and his family were. Tommy said he had just gotten a postcard from the National Gallery of Art, one of those Vermeer pictures, the stolen one from Frog. Calder couldn't wait to tell Tommy what was going on, but he knew he and Petra had to keep quiet for the moment. He called Petra immediately. He was thrilled to hear about Tommy. Calder went on. Remember the N for National Gallery? That day we were trying to get the pentominoes to say something about where Frog was? That day with the frog napkins and the rain? Uh-huh. Calder filled Petra in on the rest of the story. Makes me think of a Charles Fort thing. Frog disappears to the National Gallery. Then a picture of the lady travels back to Tommy. It's not teleportation, but some kind of strange symmetry. Calder was quiet for a moment. Or some kind of weird joke, Petra finished. Things going together that don't seem like they should. Things with a scary sense of humor, added Calder. And that is the end of chapter 18. Bye, everyone.